There's a layer of MMO design most players never think about. Not the combat, not the story, not even the loot. It's the buff system. The invisible architecture underneath every group encounter that decides who matters, who's optional, and who secretly wishes that they were playing a different class. And the reason nobody talks about it is because when it works, you don't notice it. You just feel strong. You feel like your group is clicking. But when it doesn't work, someone is miserable. Someone is playing a role they didn't sign up for. And slowly, quietly, they stop logging in. This is the problem developers have been trying to solve for 20 years. And depending on who you ask, every major MMO has gotten it wrong in a completely different way. The Holy Trinity. Tank, healer, DPS. For a long time this was enough. The roles were clear. You knew what you were signing up for, the buff system was simple. Healers kept people alive, tanks held aggro, DPS burned things down. There were some utility buffs floating around the edges, but they were flavoring. They didn't define you. Classic WoW is the clearest example of this working. You were a warrior who happened to provide battle shout. You were a paladin who popped Blessing of Kings on the group. The buffs felt like extensions of your identity, not replacements for it. But the developers looked at the system and decided it was too simple, too static. Players needed more reasons to bring specific classes. The method needed more depth. And that's where things started going wrong. Guild Wars 2 made the boldest attempt to modernize the buff system. They stripped away the traditional trinity. No dedicated healers required, no rigid roles, just a flexible combat system built around player expression. Except, and this is the part nobody advertises, they replaced the old trinity with something arguably more restrictive. 2 boons, Alacrity and Quickness. These became the mandatory buffs for any group that actually wanted to perform. High tier fractals, raids, challenging content. If your group didn't have full uptime on both, you were running at a significant disadvantage. Not impossible, just noticeably frustratingly worse. So someone had to provide them. Here's where the system quietly breaks, because nobody queues into an MMO thinking, I hope I get to press the Alacrity off cooldown and optimize my gear around maintaining uptime for strangers. They queue in because they want to play their class, they want to be a renegade, a guardian, an engineer, they have a fantasy in mind. But the LFG experience doesn't care about your fantasy. And it says looking for a lack. And either you swap to the build that provides it, or you sit in the queue longer, and slowly without fully realizing, you stop being a renegade who occasionally supports your team. You become the Alac renegade. That becomes your identity. Your gear is built around it. Your rotation is optimized for it. You're not playing your class anymore. You're performing a function. And here's the uncomfortable truth about MMO players. Most people want to deal damage. Not because support isn't fun, it can be genuinely rewarding. But the moment support becomes mandatory, rather than chosen, the whole dynamic shifts. Someone always gets stuck. The person who swaps because nobody else will. The person who quietly resents every raid night because they're pressing the same button on cooldown while everyone else gets to actually play. That's a tax. Final Fantasy XIV goes a different direction entirely. As I understand it, and I'll be honest, I haven't played it deeply, the buff system is built around synchronized rotational windows, usually 2 minutes. Most jobs contribute their buffs in a coordinated burst, and the whole encounter is kind of designed around that rhythm. It's elegant in theory. When it works, you feel like a well-oiled machine, everyone contributing, everyone mattering. But it can also feel like the game is playing itself, like the rotation isn't something you're executing. It's something you're being carried through. Clockwork, predetermined. And for some players, that friction between this feels precise and this feels scripted never fully resolves. Still, and this matters, it doesn't punish individual players for the group's composition. You're not the Alac renegade, you're a bard who has buffs as part of a broader kit. The identity stays intact, that's worth something. Retail WoW takes a cleaner approach to the problem. Bloodlust, heroism, 1B cooldown, massive impact, short window. The strategic version of this is generally satisfying. You hold it for a critical phase, you pop it at the right moment, you feel the difference. The non-strategic version is someone hitting it at the pull and calling it a day. Both happen frequently. But here's what WoW gets right, what Guild Wars 2 doesn't. The buff doesn't replace our identity. You're a mage who has Bloodlust, not a Bloodlust delivery system who casts Fireball on the side. The cooldown is part of your kit without becoming the whole point of your existence. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Because the moment a buff becomes your primary contribution to a group, the game has quietly told you that your class fantasy is secondary to your utility function. WoW mostly avoids that, mostly. OSRS sits at the opposite end of the spectrum. Potions, prayers, equipment, everything boosts your own stats. Your performance is yours. The optimization loop is deeply personal, and there's something genuinely satisfying about that, knowing your numbers, maximizing your own output. But in group content, that individualism creates a ceiling. If your buffs only affect yourself, the group dynamic changes. You're not coordinating, you're just running parallel individual sessions near each other. The Holy Trinity doesn't really exist. The strategic layer of what does our group composition enable largely disappears, which is fine for what OSRS is. But it's an example of a buff system that by design can create the kind of coordinated group identity that other MMOs are chasing. The best system is probably somewhere between WoW and Guild Wars 2, but titled towards the WoW end. 1 or 2 meaningful group cooldowns that require actual coordination used strategically, something that creates a remember when we held Bloodlust and skipped the entire third phase moment that's worth building around. What it should never be is a mandatory uptime maintenance role that someone has to fill whether they want to or not. The support fantasy should exist, fully and unapologetically. Some players genuinely love being the person who makes everyone else better. They should be able to opt into that completely. Dedicated build, dedicated gear, the whole thing. But the game needs to be balanced so that not having one isn't a death sentence, so that a group of 5 DPS players with smart cooldown usage can clear the same content, just differently. Not worse, differently. That is generally a balancing nightmare, but it's the only version that respects both kinds of players. Because the core problem with every buff system we've looked at is the same thing dressed up in different clothes. Developers design for the optimal group, the perfect composition, the maximum efficiency ceiling, and then players experience the gap between that ceiling and reality. The raid night where nobody has Alacrity, the pug where Bloodlust got burned on trash, the fractal where you're the only one who read the build guide, now you're carrying something you didn't volunteer to carry. The buff system is where MMO design philosophy gets exposed. It tells you whether the developers trust their players to make interesting choices, or whether they've quietly decided the optimal play should look the same for everyone. The Holy Trinity was simple, maybe too simple, but at least it was honest about what it was asking of you.